let's go. Let's roll it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anna, for the presentation. Hi, everyone. Happy that you've joined our webinar and hope that for the next almost an hour, you'll get answers to some of your questions. So, let us start with what kind of things we're going to be talking about today. And actually, we'll be talking about IELTS writing, but not both tasks, but one of them, which is Academic Writing Task 1. Some of you participated in a webinar with Chris on Tuesday, where Chris was focusing on essays. So basically, today we're dealing with Writing Task 1. And I'd like to start with a question about your needs and your experience in preparing for IELTS. So could I ask you to write or type your answer to the following question in the chat box? Which section of the IELTS exam, listening, reading, writing, or speaking, is the most difficult, or maybe two? Let's take a minute for writing this in the chat box. Okay, looks like for now we have quite a few answers with writing. I'm not surprised. All right, some of you have difficulty with reading and speaking. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. All right, so basically, as I expected, most of the difficulties are with writing, and actually, in my experience, from my experience as a teacher and teacher trainer of IELTS, basically IELTS is difficult in terms of writing for many different reasons. Okay, so now, just a moment. No. Since some of you might not know some basic information about IELTS Writing Task 1, let me ask you the following question. So which of these are about Writing Task 1 academic? And I'd like to ask you to write just the letters in the chat box. Which of these are about Academic Writing Task 1? Okay. Right. So you are absolutely right. So if we talk about Writing Task 1, these are A, D, F, and G. So it looks like we have some experts here, or at least you are familiar in a basic level with what IELTS Writing Task 1 is about. All right, so let's get down to business and actually talk about the typical problems that IELTS students and test takers of IELTS face. And actually, these are 10 most typical problems for two reasons. So number one, this is about many students and many test takers. So basically, it's again based on the experience of my own and experience of my colleagues. And another problem is that these problems will affect the score, and typically candidates get a lower score because of not knowing about these problems or because of being trapped in these problems. And we'll start with number one, which is not knowing what to expect from the exam. So basically, based on our previous questions, you do know some stuff, which is very good. But this is about, first, what kind of visuals or types of tasks we might have in Writing Task 1 for starters. And more than that, this is about what kind of information is important about each type of task. So basically, when we talk about preparation, we need to know what kind of things to expect, right? And actually cover all of them, because being underprepared might end up having a situation when you have a task that you are not familiar with. And I actually would like you to take a look at these 6 types of tasks in writing task 1, and in the chat box, in the chat box, write their name. So for example, A is a line graph. So what are the other types of diagrams? All right. So let's see the answers. So if we talk about these tasks, so B is a bar chart, or another name for it is a bar graph, although a bit outdated. If we look at C, this is a table, or a more general word will be a chart. With D, it's a tricky thing, because if we look at these two diagrams, so we actually see charts, pie charts, right? But you might have a combination of A, B, C, or D in any possible way, and then these would be called multiple charts. And then the final two will be maps and processes. So basically, when we talk about preparation, it's a very good idea to be familiar with all the types of questions and basically what you can find in the questions. But a more important question will be what is important about each kind of visual. And I'd like to share with you some tasks that you might find useful in terms of the tasks in writing task 1 and what is important about them. So you can see here the same or very similar tasks from writing task 1. And it is important to know some main features about these tasks. So if we talk about a chart, like a line graph, bar chart, table, pie chart, and multiple charts, we talk about trends, right? So basically, we talk about some key changes that take place over time, or some key features if we talk about 1 year only, fixed time. Then if we talk about processes like this one, right? So we talk about some steps or stages, right? And then basically this information will be important in order to describe these kinds of tasks. And if we talk about maps, a typical situation is that we have maps, two probably maps of one and the same city, but in different years. And what is important here is basically changes that have taken place. So something which has appeared, something which was demolished, for example, something which was expanded. So basically, this is a key piece of information, but at the same time, this will be important in terms of understanding what kind of things to describe and what to focus on. And we can actually move on to our next part. And I'd like us to look at this line graph and decide what kind of information, A, B, C, D, E, we should describe in responses. And then can you please type your answers, your letters in the chat box. So actually, here we talk about B and C. And let me explain what these mean. So if we talk about a line graph, we talk about some changes, right? So some lines go up or go down. So basically we call these factors, something that we can physically see in the line graph, right? Over this period of time. And if we talk about figures, we talk about actual numbers. So if you look at, for example, a vertical axis, you will see numbers 0.2, 0.4, 0.6. So we talk about numbers of figures that illustrate those changes. So for example, one of the lines starts at 1.2 in the first year and then finishes at almost 0.2 in the final year, right? So these are important things. So actually, if we talk about this type, this typical problem, so this is about knowing what to include and what not to include, and actually personal opinions like what we think about the situation or the reasons behind what's happening, as well as predictions about the future if this information is not given, sorry, in the task or in the diagram, should not be or must not be present in the response. So basically, we talk about only factual information, so information which we can see in the line graphs. And there are many situations when students or candidates, not knowing this, include this information, and then they will be penalized for using this, as this is not what is asked in the task, right? And actually, this might lead to a penalty of not having enough words, like 150 words as such. So basically, this is something important to remember. And let me illustrate it with an answer that you might have or you might see. So if we look at the final paragraph here, which actually describes the same line graph, you will see that in the conclusion, the author says, I can easily predict that, which means that this information is A, opinion, and B, prediction, right? And this information is not given in the tasks. So actually this is useless and actually leads to a bit of a problem when we talk about describing the line graph. Okay, so let's move on and talk about the next problem. And I think this is a typical problem with many students and especially candidates. So it basically means that when our writing time starts, or when we have the task at hand, we start writing at the very same moment without actually taking time to do some other things, like reading the description. So basically what the visual describes. Every single task tells us that, for example, this line graph describes and what kind of information in terms of, for example, some features, time, and place. And not paying attention to this might lead to misunderstanding some information. Then this is about looking at the chart itself. So when we talk about, for example, line graphs and bar charts, we look at vertical and horizontal axis, look at the measurements, right? Like time, dates, years, right? So we need to spend some time, maybe some little time, but still pay attention to that. Then another thing is actually planning how a response will be organized, right? So basically, it is important to think about in what way to write information, how to group it, right? Because this is one of the things examiners focus on. Then I'd suggest that we focus on these things for about up to 5 minutes at the beginning, right? So actually, when we're new to these tasks, it takes us more time. But at the same time, with practice, we might have like 1, 2, maybe 3 minutes for this, and we'll have enough information in our head and mind in order to start describing. So basically, problem number 3 leads to a solution, like spend some time and actually familiarize yourself with the task and information in the task. And I'd like to illustrate that with some steps that we can make in order to do that. So for example, the task here, it's about 4 coffee shops in Australia in 2005 and 2015. So basically, first we need to look at what this graph describes. So basically, we have 4 different types of cafes, Australia, and time period. Why is this important? So first of all, this is about time because later we'll decide on some grammar. Then if we know what it is about, then it's easier for us to get to know details, right? So basically here you have a task to decide what this graph shows. Then the next piece of information is actually about the axes themselves, right? So we have here the vertical axis is about profit in $1 million. It's not percentage, it's important. And then we have years from 2005 to 2015. Then the next piece of information is about changes, right? So I previously mentioned about 2005, 2015. So this is a period of time in the past. So it directly affects the choice of the grammar. So we would probably use something like past simple, maybe past continuous. We could also use past perfect, but we'd hardly use present simple or something like this, right? So this is an important, maybe detail, but still important to look at. And then we could also look at, okay, just a moment. We could also look at some trends. So basically whether figures increase, decrease, whether they remain the same or there's some periods of fluctuation, right? So basically here we focus on some key information and we'll discuss that a bit later today. And actually we group these trends by similarity or difference, which will help us organize the response more effectively, which ultimately will lead to a better score. Okay, so let's move on and talk about the next thing. The next problem is actually related to what we have just mentioned. This is about summarizing main features. Many students who start their preparation and many candidates who take the test without being prepared properly actually do not include any information about main features and, more importantly, summary of main features. So basically, just describing a chart, being it a line graph or a bar chart or a pie chart or whatever, is not enough, right? So basically, it's only part of the score. We must provide a summary, and actually this summary is included in the assessment criteria, which we'll be looking at in a moment. So actually, absence of a summary will lead to a penalty. And what I mean here, if we talk about writing, writing is assessed by specially trained written examiners. So actually, these examiners have some sort of guidance as for what the candidate should do in order to reach this or that band. And if we look at the description of one of the criteria, which we call task achievement for band 6, for example, we can see that here we need to include an overview for band 6 with information appropriately selected, meaning that this is a must-have thing in the response. Then if we look at band 5, the second bullet point recounts detail mechanical with no clear overview. So it means that if we don't have an overview or it's not a clear overview, we automatically get band 5 for task achievement, which will affect the overall score. So basically, although these candidates do not include it, right, this is important, and as I've mentioned already, this leads to a lower score. So basically knowing what to write about is an important point to consider. And let me illustrate it with some tasks that we can have in order to focus on the overview of main features of main trends. So if we look at this task, this is basically about two types of commuting to work. One, the green line is cycling to work, and the red one is driving. And we talk about the period from 2000 to 2015. So basically we can see that the lines change, right? So the red one slowly moves down and the green one slowly or even more steeply moves up. Right, so we can talk about trends, and if we look at this task here, so generally the number of adults traveling to work by car demonstrating an upward trend. So if we look at driving, so actually it's not true, it's a downward trend, and basically this is the trend for this line. And if we look at the green one, so we can say that the green one demonstrated an increasing trend, right? So before we start our description, we need to have a look at these main features, and again, not having it in the response will lead to a penalty and a lower score. So that's why basically it's a good idea when looking at the bar chart, the pie chart, or the line graph, actually identify these trends. A similar thing could be done with, and will be done surely, with processes and maps, but they look slightly different. So a conclusion here will be to, for sure, include an overview of these main features. And when we talk about main features, we talk about some key things and not details, not minor things, but some important things. And we will actually look at another problem which is directly linked to this one, which means basically describing all the details one by one. And why is it a problem? So basically, oftentimes we don't know what kind of information to describe, and we describe everything we see, which is fair enough, because if we are not prepared, we don't know how to do that. Another thing is about basically organizing the response. So how should we do that? And there is another thing, basically grouping information. So a little bit earlier, we talked about grouping information or grouping trends by similarity. So this is a good thing to do. And basically, this is what should be done in terms of planning before we start writing. So basically, we need to take some time, as I mentioned before, to think about what information to include and how to organize it. For example, let's look at one interesting task. This is the same task about 4 cafes in Richmond, Australia. And this is an answer to this task. And we have something like, yeah, we have 4 paragraphs here, with the first one being a paraphrase of the task, a must-have part in the response, and then 4 other paragraphs. So why do we have these paragraphs? Why cannot we write it as one single paragraph? Actually, the answer is that we organize information according to some principles. So this paragraph is actually an overview of main trends. So if we talk about these 4 cafes, so we could identify the fact that 2 of them actually had a decreasing trend, right? Like the green and the blue line, Coffee Day and Short Street Coffee. And then the other 2 had different trends. So Richmond Blue had fluctuation, period of fluctuation plus increase at the end, and Richmond just fluctuation. So basically, we could have a separate paragraph for that, or we could write it as part of introduction. As well as that, we could write it in the conclusion, no problems at all. But we remember that we must have it. Then the other 2 paragraphs actually are organized in a special way. So basically, 2 coffee shops here are described together because both of them, as I mentioned before, have downward patterns, right? So the figures were decreasing. Unlike the last paragraph where the other 2 cafes are described because they have different patterns. So basically, before we start writing, we must have something like a draft of how we are going to describe our response. And actually, this is some sort of like big picture planning. Without this big picture planning, again, the score might be lower because the information isn't clearly organized. And as a result, it isn't easy to follow. So actually, this is a good thing to practice with any type of task in writing task 1. And model answers like this one will help us better understand this. And let's get back to our next problem. And next problem will be related to the use of language. So far we've talked about achieving the task, so task achievement and organization. But now let's talk about vocabulary. So actually, those of us who are not prepared for the exam might use the vocab that we know, but this is not specific for the task. But a good idea is to know better vocabulary, more specific for the task, because this is about a variety of language, and the more varied our language is, the higher score we could have. Then it's about repetition. So when we know synonyms, variety, we could avoid using the same words or the same vocabulary over and over again, which basically, again, might lead to a better score. And as a result, a better score, as I mentioned. One important thing is that it's not helpful to use just 1 or 2 big words, and then all the other words will be very simple. So we need to include this good vocabulary, better vocabulary consistently. Let's have a look at 2 sentences describing a number of cyclists. So actually, Yeah, take some time and read. So what's the difference between these two sentences? Which is a good way or use of language and which is not? So can you please type A or B in the chat box? Yeah, you've probably noticed that we basically have some simple vocab like went up a bit, went down a bit, and was the same. But a better choice of vocabulary will be increased insignificantly. And by just looking at these words, you can see that they are higher level. Then there was a slight decline or a period of stability. So actually, here we can talk about um, examples of better use of language, and they are used more or less consistently. And again, let me illustrate it with some examples of what we have here. So we can have actually very different sets of language. And here we have an IELTS writing bank on our platform. So we could describe basically ups and downs, fluctuation, stability, uh, and basically lots of different things. So actually, it's really worth spending some time and learn some good vocab in order to basically use better vocab and as a result increase the level of the response and our score. So it's a good idea to expand vocabulary. Then another thing to pay attention to will be about models to follow. So what I mean, if we talk about preparing for IELTS Writing Task 1, we do have tasks, we can have some guidance, but we need to see how actually to write. We need to see examples of responses or models where we could see actually how to do that, right? And we can actually have two different kinds of models. So for example, one of them will be a model that we can use to analyze in what way to describe the chart, like analyze it for the structure, analyze it for the language. And we could also use model answers to see basically answers to the responses that we have written. So for example, when you have a new task to write, yeah, you have written it, but how can you see an example for it in order to improve your understanding? So actually, this can be realized by looking at some models. And if, for example, we could look at the practice for processes on the platform that you have signed up for, we could actually see that we have some examples like this here. So at first we have some guidance as for how to understand the task, right? So some questions answering each will help you better understand what to focus on. Then some help with organization, right? Yep. Then you have basically some notes to help you and choose some time to do that. And then you can start. So actually, here is where you have your description. And when you finish writing, you will actually see a model answer. I'm sorry. You will actually see a model answer, which will help you see. Oh, I think I've shown the wrong one. Yeah, basically, which help you see how to do that. So returning to one of the answers that I had before, right? So on the platform, we do have models, right? And these could be good models to orient towards, or models with some mistakes to spot them, right? So it's a good idea actually to see the examples of good models. And these models could be analyzed, right? So after you have written your response, right, it's a good idea to see how others have done it, right, and how to do it in a proper way, right? And you can spend some time looking at how the answer is organized, what kind of useful vocab or useful information we have there. So after we have written our response, again, a good idea will be to take some time and actually use it. I see some questions in the chat box. So at the end of the webinar, we will have a Q&A part where I'll be answering your questions, all right? So then if you have questions, please type them up in the chat box, right? But we'll get back to them a bit later. Okay, so then let's move on and talk about the next part, which is, I'm afraid, one of the biggest hurdles or one of the biggest challenges that many candidates have in the real exam. So just a second, I'm sorry. So actually, the most typical problem is that candidates do not have enough time for this. If we talk about having just 20 minutes and writing 150 words, it's really difficult to do that, right? Especially when we are not trained enough, when we didn't have enough time to practice all the questions, right? So this is a typical problem, right? But this is a very important step, because oftentimes when we write, we don't spot or don't see the mistakes, right? Because actually we're focusing on what to write about, how to organize, sometimes what language to choose if we are hesitating, right? So actually it's worth spending some time on checking the response. And it's a good idea to find a few minutes at the end of the writing time. Then I'd suggest focusing on some typical problems that we have. So for example, sometimes I have problems with using punctuation, and when I have time to check, I do focus on punctuation. Or maybe sometimes I make mistakes with, for example, spelling, like double letters. So I know that these are my typical issues, right? So when checking the response, I'd focus on fixing them. Another thing is basically focusing on most common mistakes generally, right? So this might be your typical mistakes and might be not. So among them will be spelling, articles, because basically we do not have articles in our native language, right? It's a typical problem. Another one that I'm experiencing more and more the other days is like subject-verb agreement. When you write something like the number of people present at the meeting are high, which is basically wrong, right? Especially when we have longer sentences, this is a problem, right? So it's worth finding a few minutes and look at these things. One more thing, if you have enough time, it's a good idea to read the response a few times, and every time you read it, focus on different sets of problems. So for example, with number one, you look at spelling, for example, and repetition of words. With number two, maybe grammar, right? So in this way, you will cover more problems. And the final thing will be actually having some sort of a checklist, which you could use after you have written every task, right? And use it all the time. So basically making it a habit. You can do it by yourself, or you can use some standard checklists. And let me illustrate this point with the checklist that we have on the platform. So actually, this is something that follows after every single task the platform users have written, right? So it focuses on, as we see here, on task achievement, on organization here, coherence, cohesion, right? And then when you answer yes or no, you actually pay attention to what kind of things you did or you didn't do, right? And this is a very good point in terms of understanding your individual strengths and what kind of things you need to improve. And also we focus on vocabulary and grammar, right? So of course, covering this whole list is a problem, right? Because it takes time, but at the same time, we can do that while preparing, and then with time we improve our speed, and actually with time we improve the efficiency of using it. Okay. Let's move on to our Okay, just a moment. We have a technical problem, and I guess you cannot see. Okay, yeah, I guess you cannot see the examples that I share um, from the platform. Just a moment, okay? All right, I hope you can see that now. So, let's point again. I'm sorry for this technical issue. So if we talk about a checklist that we can use in order to describe, uh, in order to check the response, we can actually use the checklist here by answering yes/no questions here, right? And they focus on task achievement, so what we did in order to answer the questions themselves, and focusing on organization. And as well as that, this is about vocabulary and grammar. And since you didn't see the previous thing, so let me quickly illustrate the points again, and I'll focus on them briefly. So if we talk about the task with main features, right? So we talked about main features of charts, trends, main features of processes, stages or steps, and main features of maps, right? So basically knowing this. Then the next point was about using reasons, opinions, and predictions, right? And in the response here on the platform, we have an opinion and prediction, right? Which must not be present in the response. The next point was about actual trends, right? And basically summarizing overview or giving an overview of main features, right? And you can have a look at each line separately, identify the trend, and then decide on the overview of trends and compare them by similarity of difference. And here you see the example of the task where I need to identify the trend for each of the lines. And if we talk about the tasks on the platform, so basically we have questions like these or tasks like these focusing on every single task. Then I also was talking about the structure of the response. Important information. Then the next paragraph is about two types of coffee shops that have the same or similar pattern, like downward. After that, we have another paragraph which focuses on two other coffee shops, and the trends are slightly different there. Then I was showing another demonstration of the use of good vocabulary, so actually task-specific vocabulary. And on the platform, once you register and pay for some of the paid options, you will see a writing bank with actual language and linking phrases, and you'll have lots of examples of the use of this language here, as well as practical tasks, which will help you understand, memorize, and actually practice these things. Okay, and then, so basically we can move on to the next thing. So I'd like you to look at these 4 questions, and in the chat box, write your answers. So do you often, yes or no? So for example, do you often write in English? Number 1, yes. Do you often describe charts and diagrams in English? For example, yes, okay? And let's take 30 seconds or 60 seconds and answer these questions in the chat box. So the point I was making is about if you answer yes, sorry, if you answer no to at least one of the questions, it actually means that you need to practice doing these things. I mean, describing graphs, charts, and diagrams, and it takes some time to develop the skill. So actually, my next point will be about the problem will be about not having enough practice, right? And if we talk about practice, and I've mentioned that this is a skill, and when we know what to do, we actually feel much better, much more confident in the exam and stress out less. So this is an important thing actually to prepare yourself for. Then this is about practicing all types of tasks, right? So we mentioned 6 of them. So when we practice only 1 or 2, of course, there are some skills that you can use for others, but it's a good idea to try all of them. And then one more thing, writing not just one task, but maybe a few, especially focusing on time limits. So in the exam, you typically have 20 or 25 minutes for task 1. So it's a good idea to practice doing that. And let me illustrate it with an example. So I'll be sharing again an example of the platform. So this time you must see it. So if we talk about the platform, actually this is the platform which looks from inside when you buy one of the packages. So if we talk about these different 6 types of diagrams, right? So we do have practice everywhere for the line graph, for the bar chart, for the table, for multiple charts, and actually even a few of them, right? Especially when we focus on two subtypes, right? So having enough practice for all of them and actually practicing a few of them more than once is an important thing to remember. So I'd suggest that when you prepare, you focus on that. And this problem is connected with the next one, which I call not using strategies consistently. So what I mean by this, when we talk about a strategy, we do focus on some things that we use repeatedly, but this is about a good approach to doing that. An approach that saves your life because you know what to do, how to do, and with practice, it becomes easier. And then when we, for example, practice using the same strategies on typical procedures, right? We spend less and less time every time. And if you remember when we were talking about, for example, planning or looking at the task and planning the response, which at the beginning might take 5 or even 10 minutes, with practice might take much less time. So basically, the conclusion here would be strategies should become part of your daily practice, right? So it should become the routine. It's like when we wash, for example, the dishes every day. Do we actually follow every single action that we make by thinking about, okay, so now I'm taking my plate, and now I'm pouring some water onto it, now I'm scrubbing it or something, right? So these actions become automatic, and actually we do them very quickly if we have lots of time, lots of practice, right? So basically we can transform this skill from, for example, washing the dishes to practicing actually writing, as well as any other skill. And again, I'd like to illustrate this point with what we have on the platform. So when we talk about every single type of task, we actually have a writing bank where we have strategies and where we have language and linking. So every single type of task is followed by a strategy, basically what you do step by step. So for example, we start with analyzing the task, and here the focus is on maps. Then we talk about planning the description and what specifically we do here. Then what kind of steps we have in order to write the description itself. And finally, this is about checking the description, right? As well as that, we do have, basically model answers, right? So these model answers, as I mentioned before, give you examples of how to organize tasks, how to group information, the use of good language, and basically these are effectively written responses which score band 7, 7.5, 8, so basically good level responses. So my final tip based on problem 10 will be about learning to use strategies all the time, and if you can transfer this strategy and use it to other types of tasks, so do use them, right? So when you practice, you actually see what can be used as a strategy and repeat it. So actually during the webinar today, we have looked at 10 different problems, most typical problems, right, that inexperienced students preparing for the exam or inexperienced test takers take. So basically, I hope that this was some sort of useful, helpful, and practical information for you. And I'd like to share with you a few words about basically the course itself. So it might seem that this is something like an easy thing to do, but from the perspective of one of the authors of the course and course coordinators, right, and teachers who've been teaching quite a while, so basically 10 years this year, I'd say that it took us a lot of time, and we did try to organize every single thing into something like a system, right? So we tried this many times. We actually consulted with our colleagues. We wrote together with our colleagues. And actually, this is a piece of work done by many people, right? So basically, it's tried, tested, and we hope that it will be useful and effective to you. And before we finish the webinar, we actually have some time. So I'm going to answer some questions that you have in the chat box.